Okay, this is me talking about Canada's changing relationship with Great Britain during the First World War. For my comp, I will argue that the war changed the relationship from one primarily based on sentiment to one primarily based on interests. The works I'm going to use are going to be Glazebrook, Stacy, Cook, Brown's biography, Hilmer and Grantstein, and Darwin, John Darwin. That's a good one. Oh, and Morton. Why not? Morton, peculiar kind of politics. So, right. So I'll do it probably in three parts. Part one will be Canada's in a background, inability to define separate interests. Part two will be changes, and that will be based on 1916. Part three will be implementation of an interest-based policy, and I will do that by contrasting the Imperial War Cabinet of April 17 to the Imperial War Cabinet of August 1918, and then I'll peace conference talk a bit about that. Okay, so that's what the scribble looks like, and that's what I have to be able to write a paper off of. So let's start with the background. So leading up to the First World War, Canada's relationship with the UK it was primarily based on sentiment, because simply we didn't even have the ability to define interests. So take, for example, the Department of External Affairs. Jack Granstein and Norman Hilmer talk about this in Empire to Umpire. The DA only had 14 people, or 14 positions, and not all those positions were filled. You look at the start of the war, Canadians were generally happy with Asquith's leadership. Beauty of hindsight. Anyway, what they didn't know. They're generally happy with leadership. They're most focused on just generating, like force generation, sending forces over. In terms of a theoretical framework, there's two works that so that's good for kind of spice, but the two real good theoretical bases of this are GPDT Glazebrook's Canada and the Peace Conference, published in 1942, and John Darwin's the Dominion idea in a third British Empire, the Dominion idea in imperial politics. So, Glazebrook has a great way to start it off. So, in Glazebrook's view, Canadians were always comfortable with empire based off of two preconditions. The first condition was that it was seen as advantageous to Canada, a good trade-off. So, for example, we gladly took over Quebec and Kingston in the 1870s, and then Halifax in 1904, because of the protection of the British fleet, access to British trade, and all that kind of stuff. The second was reasonable, that we thought was reasonable. Now, reasonable is interesting because it's perception, right? What do you think is a reasonable level of control from the UK? Or from London, rather. So, in 1914, it seemed reasonable that the British would declare war and kind of control the war effort because, one, they controlled the Navy, and two, they had a big army. Canada didn't really have much. We had a permanent force of about 3,000 to 4,000 people. So, and we had a militia. It would take time to mobilize. We didn't have factories, all that kind of noise. But as Canada got stronger in terms of its ability to just project military force, industrial power, and all that kind of stuff. Um, as it got stronger, what was considered reasonable um, in terms of our control from London uh, changed, and also what was considered advantageous changed because, I mean, if you're losing, um, in 1918 we lose about 60,000 people dead, not to mention wounded. Um, is it really worth it? It's a good question. So, the second bit was another theoretical way of thinking about this is John Darwin's work on called the Dominion Idea in Imperial Politics. So Darwin sort of tracks the development of what's called a Britannic nationalism, which is very different than a British nationalism. It's kind of like trying to sound like a political scientist here, but a supranationalism, kind of like an international civic nationalism, if you would. And this was a nationalism based off institutions. Now, one of those institutions, like preference for British institutions, and one of those institutions, like we're talking about all the way back to Brian P. Farrell and all that kind of stuff, liberal empire, right? So in a liberal empire, you have all these self-governing dominions, at least the white dominions, and eventually India, as they saw it, eventually India. One of the beauties of the British Empire that made people like the idea of the British Empire was the fact that it wasn't too imperial. So the minute you start fighting a war and it becomes very much you have kind of centrally directed war policy, then it actually sort of diminishes the underlying support for the empire to begin with. So that's it's a very good article. You should read your book chapter, but in terms of it deserves more context. But I have an hour to write this, so that's all it's getting. So with that, there's that strong sentiment. There aren't those real institutions to define stuff. 1916, part 2. 1916 proves the key year. Few things happened in 1916. One is just the expansion of just Canada's state machinery, the ability to deal with stuff. So up until then, Borden actually had a pretty weak cabinet. For example, he couldn't really fire Sam Hughes, even though Hughes increasingly got erratic throughout 1916, primarily because Hughes was a big man in the party. So even as kind of scandals about, for example, the Shell Committee came out, he couldn't do much about it. Second thing, so yeah, he just had a weak cabinet. So one thing that happens is basically Hughes gets booted. And Hughes actually gets booted. One of the big scandals, besides the who wrote the Michael Bliss's book might be good mentioning here. Michael Bliss's biography of Joseph Lavelle. Michael Bliss actually argues that what killed Hughes wasn't the Ross rifle or mismanagement. It was actually the Shell Committee crisis. They were just so corrupt. It was an embarrassment. So Hughes he also gets his fingers in an investigation of Canadian medical services overseas that turns out to be politically damaging, and he's trying to set up throughout 1916 a replica of the Militia Council to kind of govern Canadian forces overseas, the same way they're governing Canada, so under his thumb. Borden tells him no, and he kind of does it anyway. He sets up a provisional council. So eventually, Borden's had enough. He waits for Hughes to go overseas. In October 1916, Hughes gets booted, and Borden sets up the Overseas Forces Ministry of Canada, OFMC, which is an extension of the cabinet system. And he sends, I think it's George Purley. he sends to kind of whip things into shape there, take control of this kind of bloated administration and corruption and duplicate training systems and all that kind of noise. So with that, now you're starting to see the cabinet actually set up posts overseas to look up Canada's interests overseas. It's kind of a weird system. It's not replicating the Second World War because we have a much stronger civil service by then, but it kind of shows that Canada's ability to define those interests has expanded, right? You now have a cabinet member full-time in the UK. Excuse me, in Britain. So you have that on one hand. On the other hand, I mean, you have the other thing you have is the British run out of troops. And in fact, we don't know, but what's the name of that article? Infantry reinforcements, was it Brown? I have to follow up on that. We started to run out, anyway, the British started to run out of people in 1916, and they need more men. The other thing that happens is that Asquith kind of runs his course. Lloyd George takes control in December 1916. So, December 1916, Lloyd George becomes Prime Minister. He'd previously been Minister of Munitions. Finds a mess, so he says, we need more men. How do we get more men? And one way to do it is to include Dominions in decision making. But they want to, I mean, Lloyd George doesn't want to offer too much decision making. He's starting from, like, Asquith had kept Canadians in the dark for so long. In fact, Canadians, South Africans, Australians, Kiwis, all those people as well. They kept the Dominions in the dark for so long that basically Lloyd George could set up the first Imperial War Cabinet in April, I believe, of 1917, where he basically where Lloyd George offers what seems like decision making, but it is more just information, letting everyone know where the British are at, in exchange for basically more men. He includes Dominion prime ministers on discussing the war in return for like a reinvigorated war effort on behalf of the Dominions to send more stuff and more people. So that's a major change, right? So and Robert Craig Brown kind of talks about this in his biography of Borden as well. At this point now, Borden is starting to, you go to these, like something like a cabinet, and from a politician's point of view, it's different than a conference, I mean, politicians are used to fighting for their particular interest, whether it be regional or portfolio or whatever else in a cabinet, and Borden goes overseas and does that very same thing. And suddenly Canada is starting to like slowly define an interest, right? It's starting to stake what its real interest is. And if you look at Borden, he actually teams up with Lloyd George to force through a resolution, or basically resolutions calling for maximum war effort, and limited aims. So what that means is basically they wanted to fight it out to the end with the Germans in Europe, but they weren't going to try to use the war as an excuse to gain a lot of colonies overseas. Kind of, let's get this done with, and let's do it well. Now, for part 3, what I'll do is I'll compare the I will compare come on. I'll compare the 2 Imperial War Conferences. There we go. There's 2 Imperial War Conferences is worth looking at different ones. This is messy. I just talked a bit about the first Imperial War Conference. The second happens in August of 1918, and we can talk. It's like a denouement about the peace conference as well. So it's really worth noting. It's worth noting just how bad things had gotten by August 1918. So, despite these calls for consultation and stuff that happened in the First Imperial War Conference, in the spring of 1918, what do you get? You get the Iron Maiden song, right? Like Passchendaele. Passchendaele happens. And Passchendaele it's so bad that when Borden hears about the casualties on the way over, I mean, Helmer Granisty talked about this, and Robert Crick Brown talks about it as well. On the way over, Borden is toying with the idea of quote unquote full autonomy from the UK, whatever that means, right? Kind of basically saying we're thinking about pulling pin, not just on the war, like the empire, like we're done. And in fact, Borden ends up telling Lloyd George at tea, goes over his house for 10 Downing Street for tea, very civilized, where he puts his cup aside and says, if you do that again, like, that's it, we're out. We're not going to leave North America ever again. So he's really showing a bit more pressure, and in fact, in August 1918, he forces through the Resolution 9 of the Imperial War Conference. So basically what that is, or War Cabinet, War Conference is bigger too, basically that there would be a reform of the imperial constitutional relations at some point after the war to give dominions more of a say. And basically it comes down to we get a say in any foreign policy in which we'll be asked to be involved with. I need to follow up on Resolution 9, though. I need to actually read it so I can explain it more clearly. Or reread it. Right. So, it brings us to the war conference, the peace conference. Now, Margaret Macmillan, of course, wrote a great book, Paris 1919, where she details how British representatives tried to kind of shimmy the Dominions into accepting a single shared Dominion seat in the British Empire delegation. The Dominions pushed back pretty hard. And it's worth noting that State Secret Council in Canada and the Asia conflict, where Borden actually gives the credit to Clemenceau for including the Canadians. So this is showing Borden's ability to kind of go outside the British Empire, and he doesn't even mind kind of letting other people know that the British House is a bit messy in order to get what he needs. So it becomes primarily based on interest, and I can conclude with saying, ultimately though, those interests, foreign interests, turn out pretty limited. So Canada gets, for example, an independent seat at the League of Nations, which is something Canada fought pretty hard for. But what does it do with that seat? It uses it to limit any kind of engagement with Europe. You have Raoul Dandurand going over and saying we live in a fireproof house far from flammable materials and so on. So that's anyway. We've defined an interest and we kind of pursued it rather narrowly after the war, which is a big change from kind of the sort of open-ended commitment given to the British at the start of the war. So that's it for me talking. When it's written, it'll be a bit more graceful.